July 8, 1944. On the northern coast of Saipan, the air was thick with the scent of cordite, death, and cloying ginger blossoms. The battle was technically over, the island declared secure by Admiral Richmond K. Turner a day earlier. Yet the killing had not stopped. It had merely changed its form. From the high cliffs, entire families were leaping to their deaths, a final, futile act of allegiance to an emperor they would never see in a nation that had promised them a glorious death over the dishonor of surrender. Below, on a narrow coastal plain, Private First Class Guy Gabaldon of the 2nd Marine Division crept toward the mouth of a cave. He was not looking for soldiers. He was hunting for ghosts. He had heard whispers, the faint cry of a child, carried on the humid breeze. It was a sound that did not belong in a landscape of total war. It was a sound of life in a place consecrated to death. He held no rifle, only a K-bar knife and a few words of broken, pidgin Japanese he had learned from his foster parents in East Los Angeles. He called into the darkness, his voice strained. He promised food. He promised water. He promised safety. He was answered with silence, a profound and terrified stillness that was more menacing than any gunshot. This is not a story about a single act of bravery, nor is it simply a chronicle of a humanitarian rescue. It is a clinical examination of a weapon more powerful than any battleship or bomber. It is the story of how an ideology, carefully constructed over decades and enforced with absolute brutality, was systematically dismantled in a matter of days. It is the story of how the sheer, overwhelming, and undeniable reality of American industrial and logistical supremacy became a psychological force, shattering a worldview not with high explosives, but with Hershey bars, canned peaches, and medical gauze. This was warfare by other means. This was the demolition of a belief system, piece by painstaking piece. The Japanese civilians on Saipan, some 22,000 of them, were not merely caught in the crossfire. They were participants, indoctrinated by a state that viewed them as assets to be expended. They had been fed a steady diet of horrific propaganda, a narrative of pure racial and spiritual terror. The Americans, they were told, were not human. They were Oni, horned devils from a land of barbarians. The official proclamations issued by the Japanese military government were explicit. Governor Takeo Yasui of the South Seas Bureau had warned them, "If you are captured by the American devils, you will be tortured without mercy. Your men will be drawn and quartered. Your women will be violated and then murdered." This was not hyperbole to them. It was gospel. It was the state-sanctioned truth. They believed it with the same fervor they believed in the divinity of their emperor. The propaganda posters depicted monstrous American soldiers with fangs and claws, carrying mutilated Japanese bodies. The radio broadcasts, crackling with static and authority, reinforced the message daily. Surrender was not an option. Capture was a fate worse than any death. Death, in fact, was the only honorable path. Death was a duty. The Imperial Japanese Army reinforced this belief with action. Soldiers were instructed to ensure civilians did not surrender. They were told it was better to give a civilian a grenade to hold against their stomach than to allow them to fall into American hands. On the cliffs of northern Saipan, this ideology reached its terrible apotheosis. Soldiers of the 43rd Division were seen actively encouraging, and in some cases forcing, civilians to jump. A Japanese soldier was witnessed executing 10 women with a machine gun rather than let them be captured. This was the logical endpoint of their entire belief system, a self-immolation born of terror and a twisted sense of honor. It was this wall of absolute, indoctrinated fear that confronted the American Marines and soldiers. They had just fought one of the most savage battles of the Pacific War. They had lost over 3,000 men killed and more than 13,000 wounded to secure this 17-kilometer-long rock. They were exhausted, traumatized, and had every reason to view every shadow and every cave with lethal suspicion. They had seen their friends killed by Japanese soldiers who feigned surrender. They had seen civilians used as human shields. And yet, an order came down from command. The civilians were to be saved. How does one fight an enemy who is not a person, but an idea? How does one defeat a lie so profound that people would rather dash their own children against rocks than surrender to the truth? The answer was not found in a field manual. It was found in the cargo hold of a Liberty ship. It was found in the quartermaster's inventory. It was found in the mundane, staggering, and relentless abundance of the American way of war. Guy Gabaldon, alone before that first cave, began the assault. He did not use bullets. He used words. He spoke of water. He spoke of food. He used the Japanese words for safety and children. For hours, there was nothing. Then, a man emerged, gaunt and terrified, holding his hands up. He was a scout, sent out to accept the horrible death that awaited them and report back if, by some miracle, he survived. Gabaldon did not shoot him. He did not torture him. He offered him a cigarette. This simple act was the first crack in the foundation of an empire's ideology. A cigarette, a small, machine-rolled tube of tobacco and paper, a product of American farms and factories, offered freely. The man smoked it, his hands shaking. He saw no devil. He saw a tired young Marine. He was given a sea ration. He was given a canteen of fresh, purified water. He was then sent back into the cave, a living witness to a truth more shocking than any propaganda. He was a Trojan horse carrying a message of unbelievable reality. Soon, he returned. With him came others. A slow, hesitant trickle of humanity emerging from the Neolithic darkness into the harsh, modern light. They were skeletal. Their clothes were rags. Many suffered from malnutrition, dysentery, and tropical ulcers. They were the physical embodiment of the scarcity and desperation that defined the Japanese war effort. They expected death. They were met with logistics. Let us consider the sea ration. To the American GI, it was monotonous, often reviled. To the civilians of Saipan, it was a miracle. A single M-unit tin of meat and vegetable hash contained 865 calories. The B-unit tin of crackers, sugar, and soluble coffee provided another 1,100 calories. A full day's ration provided nearly 3,700 calories, a scientifically balanced diet designed by the Office of the Quartermaster General to sustain a fighting man in any environment on Earth. It was a product of an industrial food system so vast, so efficient, that it could feed millions of soldiers across 2 oceans and still have enough surplus to hand out to its enemies. The Japanese civilians had been subsisting on a handful of maggot-infested rice, boiled tree bark, and the occasional snail. They had watched their children starve. Now, they were being handed a can of processed food, a testament to a level of production and distribution they could not possibly comprehend. 1 can of hash represented more calories than many of them had consumed in a week. And the Americans had mountains of them. They used crates of sea rations to weigh down tarps. They used them as stools. Their abundance was casual, almost insulting. Then there was the water. On a tropical island, fresh water was life itself. The civilians had been drinking from stagnant pools, risking cholera and dysentery with every sip. The Americans brought water purification plants ashore with them. They had mobile units capable of processing thousands of gallons per day. Every soldier carried a canteen filled with potable water, treated with halazone tablets, another mass-produced chemical wonder. They gave this water freely, pouring it into the cupped hands of children, filling the scavenged gourds of old women. They were dispensing life from a seemingly infinite source. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. One Japanese woman, years later, recalled the moment a Marine gave her child a piece of chocolate. "I was so frightened," she said through a translator. "We were told they would eat our children. Instead, they fed my child." He gave him a piece of candy. I looked at the candy, and I looked at the soldier. And I knew then that everything we had been told was a lie. Everything. This scene was repeated hundreds of times across the northern end of the island. The initial contact was always the most dangerous. Marines would approach a cave, calling out in broken Japanese. Sometimes they were met with a grenade. But more often, they were met with a terrified silence. They would leave food and water at the cave entrance and retreat. The next day, the food would be gone. They would return and leave more. This process, a patient siege of calories and compassion, began to work. The numbers started to grow. Gabaldon himself, in a single day, is credited with persuading over 800 Japanese civilians and soldiers to surrender, an act for which he was later awarded the Navy Cross. He was not alone. Other Japanese-American interpreters, Nisei soldiers of the Military Intelligence Service, were brought in. They could speak the language fluently, bridging the cultural and linguistic chasm. They could explain the impossible, that the Americans were not there to exterminate them, but to help them. The core of the operation was the establishment of a massive civilian internment camp, Camp Susup. This was not a death camp or a concentration camp in the Axis model. It was a logistical city willed into existence on a barren plain by the United States Navy's Seabees. They bulldozed roads. They erected thousands of tents. They built cookhouses and latrines. They laid pipes for fresh water. Within weeks, it was the largest settlement on the island, housing over 10,000 people. The very existence of Camp Susup was a weapon. It was a demonstration of power. While the Japanese Empire was running out of steel, oil, and rice, the Americans could afford to divert immense resources to care for enemy noncombatants in the middle of a war zone. They flew in doctors and nurses from the Public Health Service. They shipped in tons of rice, not sea rations, understanding the dietary needs of the population. They provided soap, clothing, and medical supplies on an industrial scale. Consider the medical care. A Navy corpsman carried a Unit 1 medical kit. It contained 12 sulfa powder packets for wound dressing, a tourniquet, iodine swabs, aspirin, and dozens of sterile battle dressings. Each platoon had a corpsman. Each company had a medical detachment. Offshore, hospital ships waited, complete with operating theaters, X-ray machines, and blood plasma banks. The civilians emerging from the caves were riddled with diseases of malnutrition and poor sanitation. They had infected wounds and tropical sores. They were met by a medical system of breathtaking sophistication. A Japanese father watched as an American doctor set his son's broken leg, a clean fracture that would have crippled the boy for life if left untreated. He saw the white plaster cast, the sterile bandages, the calm efficiency of the medics. His own government had offered his son nothing but a grenade. The enemy offered him orthopedic surgery. How could the propaganda possibly survive such a direct, personal, and profound contradiction? It could not. The ideological demolition was accelerating. The most powerful tool was word of mouth. The first civilians who surrendered and were treated well became the most effective propaganda weapon the Americans had. They were allowed to go back to the cliffs and caves, sometimes with loudspeakers, to call to their friends and relatives still in hiding. They were living proof that the stories of torture and death were false. One man, a schoolteacher, spoke through a captured Japanese public address system for hours, his voice echoing across the rocky terrain. "I am speaking to you as a Japanese," he pleaded. "The Americans have given us food. They have given us medicine. Our children are safe. Do not believe the lies of the military. Come out. It is your only chance to live." The result was a flood. In one area, a group of over 1,200 civilians had hidden deep within a massive cave system honeycombed with tunnels. They were among the most resistant, led by a fanatical Japanese sergeant who promised them all a glorious death. For days, they refused to emerge. The Marines of the 24th Regiment knew they were there. They could hear them. A frontal assault would have been a massacre for both sides. Instead of dynamite, they used logistics. They diverted the output of a mobile water purification unit, running a hose to the mouth of the main cave. They began pumping thousands of gallons of fresh water into a cistern just outside the entrance. They stacked case after case of C rations, K rations, and captured Japanese rice in plain sight. They set up a field kitchen and began cooking, letting the smell of warm food drift into the tunnels. They did not shout threats. They did not fire their weapons. They simply demonstrated their infinite capacity to provide. Inside the cave, the civilians were starving. Their water was gone. The sergeant's rhetoric about glorious death began to ring hollow in the face of their children's crying and the gnawing hunger in their own stomachs. They could smell the food. They could hear the gushing of the water. The contrast between their squalid, dying reality and the world of effortless abundance just a few feet away was too much to bear. The ideological battle for those 1,200 souls was a war between a promise of a noble death and the tangible evidence of a supported life. The Japanese ideology offered them an honorable end in the darkness. The Americans offered them a can of peaches in the sunlight. In the end, there was no contest. A few civilians, braver than the rest, crept out. They drank the water. They ate the food. They were not harmed. They returned, and the spell was broken. The sergeant, his authority, and his entire belief system rendered obsolete, committed suicide. The next morning, over 1,200 men, women, and children walked out of the cave into the care of the United States Marine Corps. This was the turning point. The ideological collapse became a rout. The very symbols of Japanese militarism were inverted. The white flags of surrender, once a mark of ultimate shame, now became a symbol of hope. Civilians began streaming down from the hills by the thousand, drawn not by force of arms, but by the gravitational pull of a system that could afford to be humane. The mathematics of this operation tell a story more profound than any single anecdote. By the end of July 1944, over 12,000 Japanese civilians had been interned and cared for in Camp Sisup. To feed this population, the U.S. Navy was shipping an estimated 10 tons of food to the island every single day, specifically for the civilian camp. This did not include the rations for the 70,000 American military personnel on the island. This was a separate, dedicated supply chain. The medical effort was just as staggering. A 500-bed field hospital was constructed for the civilians. Records show that in the first month, doctors performed over 300 major surgeries and treated more than 5,000 cases of malnutrition and disease. They administered thousands of doses of penicillin, a new wonder drug that the Japanese military-industrial complex could not hope to mass-produce. They were, in effect, fighting a public health war and a military war simultaneously, and winning both through sheer industrial might. Let us contrast this with the Japanese position. The garrison on Saipan had been slowly starving for months before the American invasion. Their supply lines were cut. Their last ration shipments had been sunk by American submarines. A Japanese soldier's daily ration, when it was available, was a fraction of the calories provided to a single American. Their medical supplies consisted of little more than crude bandages and herbal remedies. The Japanese war machine was running on empty. It demanded spiritual purity and sacrifice from its people because it could no longer provide them with material sustenance. It was an ideology of scarcity. The Americans brought an ideology of abundance. Their power was not spiritual, it was material, tangible, and overwhelming. They did not need to demand sacrifice from a position of weakness. They could demonstrate magnanimity from a position of unassailable strength. The kindness shown to the civilians on Saipan was not, at its root, an act of pure altruism. It was a strategic operation, a demonstration. It was the logical extension of an industrial system that could produce more aircraft carriers, more bombers, more tanks, more bullets, and more cans of Spam than the rest of the world combined. They could afford to turn this immense productive power toward the act of saving lives, even as they were prosecuting a war to take them. This fact was not lost on the Japanese leadership. Post-war interrogations of high-ranking officials revealed that the reports from Saipan were a source of profound shock and despair within the government. It was not the loss of the island itself. That was a strategic setback they had anticipated. It was the news of the civilian camp. It was the stories of the rescue. It was the undeniable proof that the Americans were not the monsters of their propaganda. More than that, it was the realization that the Americans possessed a logistical and industrial capacity so vast that they could casually undertake a massive humanitarian relief effort in the midst of a battle. One captured Japanese admiral, upon hearing of the events on Saipan, reportedly fell silent for a long time before saying, "This is a war we cannot win." He was not talking about tactics or strategy. He was talking about the fundamental disparity between two systems. One was a closed, authoritarian society that had bled its people dry in the name of expansion. The other was an open, democratic society that, once mobilized, could produce a torrent of material goods that was simply biblical in its scope. The aftermath for the civilians of Saipan was a transformation. They had entered the caves as subjects of the emperor, firm believers in the Kokutai, the mystical national essence of Japan. They emerged as refugees, their faith shattered, their entire conception of the world turned upside down. They had been prepared for a glorious death, and were instead handed an ignominious life, a life sustained by their enemies. The psychological shock, the cognitive dissonance, was immense. A final summary of the numbers is warranted, for it is in these cold figures that the true scale of the ideological demolition can be understood. Out of a pre-invasion civilian population of approximately 22,000, somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 died, the vast majority by suicide, driven by the lies of their own government. But over 12,000 were saved. They were housed in a camp built in less than 2 weeks. They were fed by a supply chain stretching 8,000 kilometers back to San Francisco. They were treated in hospitals staffed by doctors and equipped with medicines that were the envy of the world. Each rescued person was a testament to a system that worked. The battle for Saipan was a victory of American arms, secured at a terrible cost in blood. But the more profound victory was not military. It was logistical. It was industrial. And ultimately, it was ideological. The United States did not simply defeat the Japanese garrison on the island. It defeated the very idea that had animated that garrison. It proved that the foundation of the Japanese militarist state, the myth of American barbarism and Japanese spiritual superiority, was a catastrophic lie. This was not accomplished through counterpropaganda or pamphlets. It was accomplished through action. It was accomplished by demonstrating a truth so plain and overwhelming that it could not be denied. The truth was that the American system could produce and deliver not just death, but also life, on a scale its enemies could not imagine. The sea ration was mightier than the sword. The hospital ship was more persuasive than the broadcast tower. The kindness of a single Marine offering a cigarette to a terrified prisoner did more to undermine the Japanese war effort than a 1,000-pound bomb. This is the enduring lesson of Saipan. It is a lesson about the nature of modern warfare, where victory is forged not only on the battlefield, but in the factory, the laboratory, and the farm. It is a testament to the fact that logistics are not merely an element of strategy, they are strategy itself. An army that can feed its prisoners is an army that has already won. A nation that can afford to show compassion to its enemy's civilians in the heat of battle is a nation whose fundamental power cannot be overcome. The war in the Pacific was a war of annihilation, a brutal, merciless conflict with deep racial animosity on both sides. But in the caves and on the cliffs of Saipan, something else happened. A different kind of war was fought. It was a war against a lie, and the lie lost. It was buried under an avalanche of material reality, a reality of abundance, of capability, and of a power so immense it could afford the ultimate luxury. It could afford to be humane.